how come there aren't more Aboriginal people, in the universities and such? And I told him the truth, and I said, well, we all drop out of school, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8. We go to work, or we end up in prison. We ended up being abducted by child welfare, all kinds of things with the justice system. We never made it out of high school, which is why we're not at the universities. I can conduct you to sites that have been pointed out to me by older members in the community and say, okay, it's as precise as this. They'd say, you see these Karaganas that are over here, and they're 20 feet high now, and their roots go way down. They said, there's about 15 bodies there. You see this piece of spruce over here? Well, there was probably about 5 there. So we've always known this.
As we're all well aware by now, 215 bodies of Indigenous children, some as young as 3 years old, were found in a mass grave in Kamloops near a residential school. And ever since, I've been wanting to talk to someone from the Indigenous community. I don't think I can ever even begin to relate to the generational trauma that the Indigenous communities in Canada have gone through and are still going through. But the least I can do is use this platform to initiate conversations that may lead to a better understanding of the history of the land that we call home. To help me with that, I invited Jerome for a conversation. Les is from the Duck Mountain region of Manitoba, and he worked as a sessional instructor for the Faculty of Social Work at University of Calgary, Aboriginal program at the Mount Royal College, and Olson Community College in Siksika Nation from 1996 until 2000, when he began full-time teaching at the University of Calgary. His interests include a wide range of Aboriginal issues, including history, spirituality, philosophy, diversity, and Aboriginal cultural change. Currently, he is not engaged with any research activity with the university, but is engaged in community work on the front lines with various Aboriginal communities across the Prairie provinces in conjunction with various Aboriginal elders and community members. If you don't have the time to watch this entire video, please download our podcast. It's called The Roop Rise Show. It is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Podcast Addict. Hello, Les.
Hello.
Thank you so much for making the time to be here today.
You're very welcome.
Could you please briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Actually, the intro is a very important piece, not just concerning myself, but with regards to having kind of a context whenever we would enter into discussion about Aboriginal or Indigenous or whatever you want to call it. My name is Jerome. I am from the Duck Mountains in Manitoba. I'm 61. I've been fortunate enough to have been born and raised in an Aboriginal community. I'm so lucky that I don't have to go through the identity conflicts that a lot of younger folks do, that they don't know what nation they belong to, and so you have no history to draw on, and you have, the history of the land and the language and all of that, those things that make, contributes to a person's identity, and we have a lot of identity conflict in Canada right now. My dad's family was Treaty Indian, they call that, in North Dakota, and then they ended up in Canada. So Canada doesn't have the same legal definitions as the United States does. Make a long story short, in Canada, sometimes we were called Indians the old way, sometimes we were called half-breeds. The word Métis came in the 1970s. And so I would identify myself as Anishinabe Michif, or Michif Anishinabe, which means Michif is mixed blood, Métis in modern lingo. And my teachings, my philosophy, the way I was raised was a mix of a Michif or Métis viewpoint, which is both Aboriginal and Caucasian, and then also a lot of strong First Nations influences. So I'm really lucky that I have that tradition to be able to draw on, and I sure have over the years. It's my connection with my community that helps me remember who I am, and not get lost in things. And so I did a lot of things, and I ended up at the University of Calgary, sort of late in life, and I worked there for 19 years, and now I'm retired from the university, and I'm back doing frontline work, which is what that was my first love with social work. So I'm good. I'm full circle now.
I'm so happy that you're doing what makes you happy, and it shows. Before I get into my series of questions, I am going to start this conversation with a monologue. So you'll have to excuse me for that, with a
Sure.
disclaimer that if I say something that may be inaccurate, I apologize in advance, because it does not come from a place of malice. It comes from a place of ignorance, which is
Yeah.
why I wanted to have this conversation with you
Yeah.
today.
Sure.
I'm going to quickly share my immigration story with you. I moved here as a child with my parents, and that was in the 90s. I remember flipping through the citizenship guide that all newcomers to Canada, they have to memorize and are then tested on it. And I remember attending the oath ceremony too when we became citizens of this country. But I do not recall any mention of Indigenous communities in either of the two. So I looked it up for the purpose of this interview, and I discovered that I was right. As of now, even after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on the federal government in its final report in December 2015, that was more than 5 years ago now,
Mhm.
to revise the Canadian Citizenship Oath and the exam guide, that hasn't happened yet. The Citizenship Guide contains only one paragraph on residential schools, and the oath does not refer to treaties with Indigenous peoples at all. And that's the introduction to Canada and its complicated history that my family and many other families in the new immigrant communities in Canada get. And they're still getting it when they move to this country. And the mention of Indigenous history is almost non existent. Malcolm X, some people may not approve of Malcolm X, but he famously said that if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And I feel that applies here. Often in immigrant communities, we hear a sentiment of gratefulness to Canada for accepting us, for allowing us to thrive. But that sentiment does not always acknowledge the Indigenous communities, because like we said, because of not knowing or because of ignorance. But I don't think that not knowing can be an excuse anymore. That's why I want to use this platform to invite you here to begin engaging in conversations that burst myths, stereotypes, and encourage new Canadians to read, to learn, to ask questions. So once again, thank you so much for being here today and
Mhm.
letting me speak my heart out.
Yeah. Good. I'm happy to be here.
In your experience as a professor, as someone who has been doing social work and on the field for a very long time, and you may have interacted with a lot of immigrant communities that I'm referring to. So, what has your experience been, and what kind of stereotypes and what kind of myths have you heard in those communities that you'd like to address?
Well, I'll keep this brief. I have to give a little bit of a prologue before that myself. Um, where I was raised, I was very unusual for having graduated high school. Most of my cousins did not. There was one other cousin who did. I was talking to somebody in the Indigenous strategy one time, and they were saying, "Geez, it's great talking with you. How come there aren't more Aboriginal people, in the universities and such?" And I told them the truth, and I said, "Well, we all drop out of school, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8. We go to work, or we get, or we end up in prison. We ended up being abducted by child welfare, all kinds of things with the justice system. Uh, we never made it out of high school, which is why we're not in the universities. Now I'm talking the 1960s, but I mean, it's still very much so now. I mean, it's a big celebration to us as we are seeing more and more Native graduate students. But again, it's a struggle to get out of the high schools because Here's an example. I happen to be good at academics. It doesn't mean that I'm smart. It means that I happen to have a gift for it, right? Like some people have a gift for sports or a gift for music. I had a gift for academics. Uh, I remember being about, I don't know, 10 in grade 5. And I remember this one clearly because I think it was kind of a starting point for me where I started to consider the outside world. Um, I hand in an assignment, and I was an AA plus student, right? So I hand in my assignment, and it was a little bit late, and she corrects it, and there you go, I got an A plus, and she says, "You do such good work, Leslie. It's too bad that you're an Indian." Oh yeah, and so you see, when you're raised with that, there's it's difficult to be in school. When the teachers themselves might have funny attitudes like that. Um, as I went through my grade schools, everybody dropped out, grade 6 to grade 7, grade 8. I continued to stay in for different reasons that I won't get into now. But it was a fluke. It was never a plan. My mom and dad totally normalized that I wouldn't finish high school. I would go out and work. Right? So by the time that I was, in my, I don't know, grade 6 or something like that, there were so few of us left in the mainstream schools that we were picked on a lot by the other kids. And it's funny, we banded together because we were all related. We banded together for protection. And it's, I don't know, it's just a commentary on human psychology. We banded together for protection, to be peaceful. And it immediately turned into aggression. So it was, one band of students against another band of students, native students versus non-native students. And the violence in the schools were carried out in the town. In the town, I could sit in a restaurant, but they might not serve me because I'm an Indian. If I went into a store, they'd follow me around. When I was small, I used to think that they were looking out for me. But later on, I realized, well, they're following me around because they're expecting me to steal something. Everybody is like that. And when everybody is like that, I guess you can retreat and become a timid non-person. Like, I don't know, maybe this is a poor example. If you beat a dog and beat a dog and beat a dog, you can get a cowering, timid dog, or you'll end up with a vicious dog. And I kind of ended up in the latter. So that the same guys that I was having problems with on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I'm back in the classroom with on Monday morning. It was really, really hard. And the person that I was then is not the person that I am now. But it was like violence was inescapable. I I could have just let myself be beaten down, but my family wasn't like that. So school was something that I just put up with. So that fired my interest for social work later. And so I think that there are a lot of similarities between Aboriginal folks here and all immigrants, because the things that people say to immigrants are the same things that people have told my family. People tell immigrants, you know, speak English, smarten up. What are you, stupid? Hey, same thing they used to tell my mom and my sisters, because my mom and my sisters and my brothers and uncles spoke several languages, but they didn't speak English very well. In our own communities, English was not well used, and so people didn't speak it very well. My mom was illiterate; she never did learn how to read or write, and so the ordinary insults that immigrant people put up with are the same as us. And so I always thought that there's a huge affinity because we're both under the umbrella of a macro system. And a macro system is a system that is so huge and so pervasive and thus so normalized that it becomes invisible to people. both the people in the larger society and the people in the smaller society, so that it becomes very difficult, for instance, for some people to appreciate what is meant by patriarchy. What is it meant to be to live under a patriarchal system? And we talk with students about how do we get out of that, and we've talked about, well, the arts. The arts are a good place because the arts is just humanity, right? Wrong. No. If you take a look at, quote, the classics, they're all written by guys. Right? And you see, it becomes so normal that it becomes invisible. And so with immigrants and with Aboriginal folks, we're under the macro system of colonization. And I learned the words for this later, but it was the first drive. So I was always interested in working with Aboriginal folks, and throughout my career, it's been mostly Aboriginal folks, sometimes with some immigrant communities and individuals, but mostly with Aboriginal. And I've worked, until I worked at the university, I had never worked ever in a quote, I don't mean any disrespect, I had never worked in a white institution ever until I went to the university. It's been always 100% Aboriginal. The organization I'm working with now is 100% Aboriginal. I came into social work to work with our people and help our people as one of us. Right? And one of us also, means one of everybody, right? The humanity. But I like that. And that's what brought me into social work. And that's what's carried me through decades of social work. And I've never lost that. And I'm still very proud of that. And I like it. And it's the profession for me. So that is kind of the driving force behind all of it, really.
Mm-hmm. There's a lack of representation as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my cousins and my family ended up in foster care in the prisons. When you read these horrible statistics, these aren't just statistics. These are my relatives. These were me at one point of my life, where I had to grow out of it and almost forcibly break out. It took an act of, determination to change the course of that river.
So how many people do you think break the pattern and are able to escape that pattern?
Well, long story short, there's more and more of us as we see success stories. Some of us have brought ourselves back through the Western education system. It's mixed blessings, right? It's kind of, a means to an end, because in the universities, to be professional means to be professional as defined by the West. And so as an Aboriginal person or as an immigrant, you're always on the outside. And everything is defined from a very Western perspective. And then they say, oh, yes. And then there's the immigrant populations. And say, oh, yes. Oh, yeah. There's also Aboriginal, right? So it's like an add-on. A good example, when I was working in child welfare, I worked in child welfare for a lot of years. And when I left child welfare, I had some, I had great friends there. And the one thing that one friend said, he was saying, an odd thing about the child welfare system is that as we're trying to include and encompass Aboriginal perspectives, he said, really, we're looking at a piece in here. If we have a central pillar of child welfare, there's a piece in here and there's a piece in here. And he said, that's not the way to do it. What we need to do is to dismantle the pillar and rebuild it. And he said, that will never happen unless there's a war. In Canada, most of the social reforms took place after World War II, or some terrible catastrophe, because it would cost a fortune. People would never stand for it, and they wouldn't see the need for it. They don't, they might not see that immigrant and Aboriginal, we can see that we're in the middle of a paradigm shift if we're talking philosophy. A paradigm shift, for instance, just to give you an example, it used to be thought, what is truth? What is real truth for sure? And they said, well, God is real truth. God is truth for sure. I'm talking Western Europe. And then all of a sudden, when the Renaissance came along, people like Galileo could have been hung for daring to say, geez, I don't think that the earth is the center of the universe. I think the sun is. And so there was a difficult period of transition. That's a paradigm shift. That's what we're in now. We're in a period of transition, a paradigm shift. And on one hand, it's great to be part of it because it's exciting that the world is changing. And it's also kind of frustrating because maybe we think it's not changing fast enough. Paradigm shifts take time because it really involves a reprogramming. You have to deprogram and reprogram to really understand another perspective. It's not an add-on.
Do you think the recent discovery of 215 children lost, forgotten, murdered, um, do you think that would act as a catalyst in this paradigm shift?
I'm trying not to roll my eyes, can you tell? It's not a recent discovery. We've always known. I remember being a kid, and we knew that there was graves all over the residentials. And there are people that pointed them out. As recently as, maybe I shouldn't say this, we have always known about the scattered graves because there are children. This discovery to Canada is nothing new to us. I've known it since I was a child. 5, 6 years old in 1965, 1966. It's reality for us. It's not a discovery.
Mm-hmm. And I've
So,
often heard a lot of Indigenous friends of mine and people that I've been reading on Twitter, and everyone saying that they've been talking about it for years, but they've never been heard. And
well, yeah, that's right. And the way that they found the bodies, has never, I'm sure it's pricey, and somebody took it seriously enough to do that. Uh, I could conduct you to sites that have been pointed out to me by older members in the community and say, okay, and it's as precise as this. They'd say, you see these Karaganas that are over here, and they're 20 feet high now, and their roots go way down. They said there's about 15 bodies there. You see this piece of spruce over here? Well, there was probably about 5 there. So we've always known this. Uh, I guess Aboriginal folks weren't considered citizens in Canada until the 1960s. I think it's 1961, and there's still a terrible tendency to look at Aboriginal folks as wards of the government. So wards like children. Our voices are not important to. Um, I'm not going to say mainstream society because we're getting a lot of support from mainstream society. A lot of people who are not Aboriginal are outraged and can't believe that they never heard this before. But where we're not getting support from is the powers that be. Noam Chomsky says that you want to find where power is, follow the money trail. And so those, the persons that really could do something, it's not in their interests to do so. Let me give you an example. Let's do a reframe. In social work jargon, it's taking we're taking a focus off of an illustrative example of Aboriginal folks. We're going to use another illustrative example that might be easier to understand because it's more common, or people have, it's just a different look at it through a different lens. So let's forget about Aboriginal people for a minute. Let's talk about uh, too many male-female relationships where if the man is invested in being the man of the family and he's in control of the family and he's going to control his wife and he's going to control his children, even at the dating era, early on, if a guy is not interested in hearing a woman's perspective, even just in dating, if a guy is not interested in hearing a woman's perspective, it's because he has something to lose by that.
Mm.
Or he doesn't want to surrender his power. Or he doesn't know how. Or he doesn't get it. So a lot of those difficulties, even in dating, when kids are, I don't know, teenagers, If there's a male-female imbalance like that, as there often is, in favor of the male, favor of the male, favor of the male, as time goes on and the male grows older, it becomes perhaps less and less in his interest to hear the woman's voice. It's easier to just control her, to shut her down. And so he does. And that's what's happening on a macro level. It's not in the interest of the government to hear voices. It's better for them to shut us down. Sometimes this is done deliberately, and sometimes I think that it's done. The sin would be, to use that word, the sin would be not thinking, just accepting and going along. On Facebook, a few days ago, I posted something that I got a kick out of. Joni Mitchell, a singer-songwriter from Canada, Saskatoon, was quoted on this, and she said that she's been hearing that the music industry, the music business, is not interested in talent. They want people who will go with the program with an image and a package and a product that can be sold. And Joni Mitchell said that's the worst thing to happen to an artist, because an artist must not listen. An artist must not cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes them artists. So, as we band together against the odd macro system, which is sometimes done deliberately and sometimes done unthinkingly, just because they do it because the guy before them did it. You know, we have to have our voices made heard, or it will just continue to go on and on and on. And it is happening, not fast enough, but we are in a paradigm shift where, quote, minority voices are being heard. When I say, quote, minority, again, I'm trying not to roll my eyes, because most of the people on planet Earth are not, quote, white, right? So it's an interesting situation.
Yesterday, I contacted a few of my friends because I told them that I was speaking to you, and I wanted to compile a few of the questions that they wanted to ask as well. So I have a couple of questions here. And one of the questions is that with the recent discovery of the 215 children in Kamloops, many of us feel and share the grief, but without the generational trauma that the Indigenous people live with, and that the new Canadians lack, both the knowledge of and the experience. What are some of the ways that the immigrant communities can be a part of your grieving journey?
There's in some of my classes, I used to teach in Indigenous studies as well, and I was head of Indigenous studies for a little while. And I've always done some Indigenous studies courses. And with those, we talk about models of colonization, models of decolonization. I like to use a model from Peru for the decolonization, just because I think it's a good one. First stage in decolonization is called recovery/rediscovery. And in recovery/rediscovery is the stage where you discover that what you've been taught is not true, or that there's been omissions of history, and that you have your own voice. And that's in the first stage of the decolonization, is discovering true history as opposed to history uh, by the macro elite, and re-educating, which means that we might have to deprogram and reprogram, what we think we know. In philosophy, geez, I forget if it's Husserl or Heidegger, they had a thing called bracketing. And they said to learn, we have to, first of all, recognize what is it that we think we know. And then we have to bracket it off, set it aside, and then we open ourselves to new ways of learning. I think that that's a great thing that immigrant folks and everybody could use, is the reprogramming of what has passed for history. Because history is written by the winners. And I think that's a good place to start. And you know what? In conjunction with that, I keep on saying this. A really, really, really great way is to just make friends. It's as simple as that. It's as simple and as difficult as that. Because if we're going to make friends with somebody outside of our social group, for instance, it's going to take an effort of will on our part to be able to put ourselves out like that. You know, are we going to be experience anger? Are we going to, you know, are we going to be looked down upon? Are we going to be disrespected? But we have to move outside of our comfort level and hook up with other human beings and make friends. And as we can make friends, that's a great way because then we begin to understand the complexity of human
Mm-hmm.
experience, you know, in this, in this area. That's a good way.
I have another difficult question here.
Okay.
One of my other friends asked, so if the same discovery was made for these 215 children, they were not Indigenous and they were Caucasian, they were white, do you think the response would have been different? Or do you feel that there was the same acknowledgement now as it would have been if it was
Well,
not Indigenous
that's
children?
kind of that's kind of a trickier question in the way that I don't want to be trite with it and give a quick and dirty answer because simplistic answers aren't good ones. So for myself, I would rather view the glass half full, and I would like to
Mhm.
think that people would be outraged. Um, I don't know about levels of intensity. I don't know if I need to get into that, but I like to look at the large scheme of things. For instance, just from my own history, I'm old enough now to have a historical perspective. Right? And I know a time, for a lot of times, that this wouldn't have caused a stir. And now it is. I'm glad that it is. How accurately can we apply the situation and shift it and superimpose it over another position? I don't know if I want to get into that, and I don't know the validity of that. I could say quickly, that I think that it wouldn't be as big of a stir. But on the other hand, I think that there are a lot of Canadians and ordinary citizens out there, who would be as outraged by the atrocities against the Japanese in Canada during World War II. Of course, there's the old Holocaust example. But even growing up as a kid in rural Manitoba, the prejudice and biases against just poor people who were, our neighbors. These are quote white people, but they were poor. You see, they were Ukrainian farmers, Russian farmers, German farmers. We banded together with the native and the poor Ukrainians and Russians and Germans because we were bound together because we were neighbors, but we were also bound because we had a commonality of not having cash, as opposed to the big farmers who did have cash. So, there's always these stories of human experience where we can connect, and we can connect. And I'm always looking for opportunities to do that. Would it be as much of a stir? You see, I think we have to take that historically again. Would it have been as much of a stir in the 1960s? No. 1970s? No. 1980s? 1980s? Well, 90s? Well, maybe. So it changes over time. History and culture changes over time. Culture is an evolving organism. And so this is why I kind of hesitate to freeze frame it and say, okay, this is culture and this is what it is. I think it's better to see culture as a living organism that changes over time. And thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of an imprecise answer.
No, I
I
like
don't know.
that. I
Do
like I
you?
like the optimism. I also feel the same. In 90s, I probably would not even, well, I didn't have any information. I didn't even
Yeah.
know about residential schools. And in
Yeah.
2000s, I kind of started getting to know about them. And then there
Yeah.
was TRC, there's more awareness. So things are changing
Yeah.
slowly but
Yeah.
surely.
I hear, a lot of my Aboriginal friends who would, jump on that answer and say, absolutely not. And I'm not disagreeing with them. it wouldn't be the same. But I also like to add in that it's ordinary citizens on a person-to-person basis that is the root of a paradigm shift. And I think that we have more supporters now than we had formerly, and so it's not quite as black and white as it used to be. Is it good? No. Um, do we have biases and misconceptions? Yes. But I like to see it as something in movement. I wouldn't disagree with Aboriginal folks who, maybe some people would call them quite radical. I wouldn't disagree with them. I've been radical. Maybe I have my good days and bad days. Maybe I have my good days when I think, I can be optimistic about this and take this as an illustrative example of culture in movement. Or maybe I'll have a bad day and say, yeah, I don't think it would. I probably have both of those, to tell you the truth. That's probably a better answer.
Well, I'll tell you from my personal experience within my community, things are changing, things are evolving. And I know from my parents' generation to my generation, there has been a shift.
Yeah, there
Absolutely.
you go. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. My generation is trying to learn more. And then my daughter is in grade 4 and she's learning about residential school in grade 4, which we didn't. So
Wonderful.
there is a shift, and we are taking
Yeah.
for her birthday coming up. We're taking her to Riding on Stone Provincial Park.
Oh, good.
So that's her birthday present. So we're going to go there and learn about the Blackfoot history. So that's
Nice.
something that we're all trying to do, like one step at a time, learn about the land that we're living in, that this is our home, and what is the history of this land.
And we are in Blackfoot territory. Again, a reframe. If we forget about Canada and Native people in Canada, let's forget about that for a second. Let's think about Europe. We can see that Germany is not Sweden. We can see that Spain is not Italy. We can see countries that share a long border, like Germany with France. But to be German is not French. In Canada, we have all of these different nations, so that you would be, in French territory or German territory or Spanish territory or North African territory, and the people are not the same, right? In Canada too. I'm Anishinabe Michif. I'm from 1,000 miles east of here. I am not Blackfoot. Mm-hmm. So yeah, a good place to start is to learn about the homeland that you're in. And this is not only Blackfoot, hasten to add. It's Blackfoot, it's Stony, it's Sutana, it's Blood. There's lots of folks as you go up more northerly, Alberta, you run into Cree and Chippewa. So, to say it's Blackfoot territory, yeah, kind of, but it's also shared by a number of other nations that are in close proximity to each other. So it's really a misconception to say this is only Blackfoot territory. There's a lot of other people here.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, Blackfoot, yes, good place to start. Where you're at.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to go in a couple of days now. I think next week, we have 3 nights planned, and we're going to go and explore the provincial park and read about all the stories there. It's going to be really exciting. Really look forward to that. So to wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to say to people who are listening for them to be better allies? I know you've already mentioned that, you've already talked about it, but is there anything that we're missing?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to add another piece into here. As just an ordinary person on the street, and as a practicing professional, not in the universities, and as a former prof in the universities, there's a terrible macro dynamic of accepting knowledge as given, because it's given to you by experts, or it's given to you by academics, or it's given to you by somebody who supposedly knows something. I think that the element of critical thinking has been a casualty. And if we stop and use critical thinking to examine taken for granted knowledge, that's an important piece. I'll say that again. Use critical thinking to examine taken for granted knowledge. For instance, addictions. Uh, Somebody is addicted. Okay, so they're addicted. They send them off to Clara's Home or Pound Makers or somewhere, and they'll dry them off for 5 days, 10 days, 30 days, and they come back and they're dry and clean and the rest of it. Why is it that they go back to their former patterns? Well, it's because it's their reality, and it's a misconception to think that the answer for anybody is to take them off to counseling or take them off to jail. I think that we ought to see the failures of prison, and the failures of counseling, and the failures of some of our intervention systems. If our intervention systems were working, a person would be taken off and, I don't know, adjusted like at a garage or something, take them in for repairs, right? And they'd repair it like, I don't know, like a stereo or something. And then they'd come back and they'd be good, right? But that doesn't happen because human beings are much more complicated than that. So why is it that we perpetuate prison systems? Why is it that we perpetuate child welfare systems? Why is it that we perpetuate the myth of counseling, that if something's wrong with you, I'll take them off to counseling and they'll come back, at 5 o'clock, like I brought my truck in to get brakes fixed. We have to a little bit of thinking, a little bit of critical thinking into taken for granted knowledge. And so critical thinking into taken for granted knowledge about Aboriginal folks and immigrant peoples and anybody and anything, critical thinking is lacking. It is not encouraged in the school system because the school system is a punitive system. You have to parrot back what the teacher or professor has said, and you're graded according to how well you can become a clone of that teacher or professor. You're not encouraged to think on your own. You might be punished. And you see how we're socialized within these macro coils that discourage critical thinking. But yet we have to break out of that, and we have to employ some critical thinking. Does this make sense? Does this work? We have to ask ourselves those questions instead of just accepting knowledge as given. We have to rebel. It takes a force of will.
I think that applies to history as well.
Absolutely.
Apply critical thinking to history as well.
Absolutely. Really, really everything.
Mm-hmm.
Ads, advertising campaigns, everything.
Well, that's a great point to end this conversation on. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I'm sure I'll be reaching out to you again if there is something else that comes up.
Can I see it sometime?
I will post it as soon as I edit it. And once I post it, I will send you a link of it.
Yeah, I'll look at it, have a coffee and laugh. Thank you for this opportunity, and, we need to have as many opportunities as this. And for many people, like there's no way I can speak for all Aboriginal folks. I speak for myself and my family.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your time.